The last thing I heard clearly before hitting the rock was Lorraine screaming my name. Then stone. Cold, flat, immovable stone against my left side, and then a ringing silence that lasted maybe 3 seconds before the pain arrived. Sharp in my ribs, hot in my right palm, a dull spreading pressure at the back of my skull that told me I'd hit my head on the way down. I lay still. Not because I'd decided to, my body made the decision for me. I stared up at a sky so blue it looked artificial, framed on all sides by October ridgeline and bare-branched hardwoods, and I tried to understand what had just happened to me. My name is Lyle. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years teaching shop class at a public high school outside Cincinnati, Ohio, raised 1 son, paid off my mortgage at 58, and 2 years ago buried my younger brother Dale after a 2-year fight with prostate cancer. I mention Dale because without Dale I might not be telling this story, not for any sentimental reason, because his death and what he left behind was the reason my daughter-in-law wanted me dead. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to go back to the beginning of that week, because the beginning is where you see all the signs I missed. Jeff had called me in late August. He had a cabin rented near Gatlinburg, Tennessee, right on the edge of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. 4 nights, a long October weekend, him and his wife Wendy and me, and Lorraine. A celebration, he'd said. Our 40th anniversary was coming up in November, and he wanted to do something special before the cold really set in. You and Mom deserve it, he'd said, and his voice had that particular softness in it that I associated with his best self, the boy who used to save me the last piece of pie without being asked. I'd been moved, more than I wanted to admit. Jeff and I had grown distant over the past 18 months or so, not fighting, not estranged, just disconnected in that quiet way that sometimes happens between fathers and adult sons, when neither one of them knows quite how to close the space. I'd missed him. This felt like a door opening. Lorraine had been quiet when I told her. Not unhappy, just quiet, in the particular way she gets when she's deciding how much to say. I'd thought she was just tired from her week. I hadn't asked. I should have asked. We'd arrived on Thursday afternoon, mid-October, the mountains already running gold and rust along the higher elevations. The cabin was nicer than anything Jeff usually went for. 2 stories, exposed beam ceilings, a wraparound porch with a view that made you forget your age. Wendy had arranged everything. The rental, the groceries already stocked in the refrigerator, a box of local wines on the counter with a handwritten tag that said for the happy couple. She was like that, organized in a way that looked effortless and probably wasn't. I'd known Wendy for 11 months. Jeff had met her at a business networking event in Columbus, and they'd married in March. Fast by any measure, but I hadn't said so out loud. She was 36, well put together, worked in something she called financial consulting that I'd never fully understood, but that seemed to involve a lot of phone calls she took in private. She was polite with me, attentive without being warm. There was a quality to the way she looked around our house the first time she visited that had made the back of my neck prickle. Not admiring, not curious, measuring. I'd told myself I was projecting. Lorraine had felt it too. She'd told me so months later, when it was too late for feeling it to matter. She said Wendy had the eyes of someone who was always pricing things. By the second morning at the cabin, everything seemed fine. Better than fine. Jeff was relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years, telling old stories at breakfast, refilling my coffee before I had to ask. Wendy was gracious and well prepared. With a hiking route already mapped out for Friday morning, one of the more scenic trails in the park, an overlook she'd apparently researched ahead of time. We'd had a good dinner Thursday evening. I went to bed feeling cautiously hopeful. The hike started at 7:30 Friday morning. The trail climbed steadily through old-growth forest, the kind where the trees are large enough to make you feel small, and the light came down in long columns through the canopy. My left knee was bothering me, but it always bothered me on inclines and I'd learned to ignore it. Lorraine walked ahead of me and Jeff dropped back periodically to check on my pace. And I remember thinking, this is what it's supposed to be. This is what family is supposed to feel like. The overlook was about 2 miles up, a rocky promontory where the trail widened, and the mountain fell away on 3 sides. On a clear morning you could see 3 ridgelines deep into the park. Wendy had stopped there and turned around to look at us with something that I'd read as enthusiasm, and now understand was something else entirely. Perfect spot for a photo, she'd said. Lyle, come stand at the edge. The view behind you is incredible. I'd moved toward the edge. It was a wide, solid-looking ledge of exposed sandstone, and there was nothing that looked dangerous about it. No ice, no loose rock, no warning signs. I was maybe 4 feet from the drop when I felt a hand flat against the center of my back. Firm, deliberate, a push that didn't hesitate. I heard Lorraine's voice spike upward, a single cut-off sound. Then the world tilted and there was nothing under my feet. I slid and bounced down a steep rocky embankment and landed on a granite shelf about 15 feet below the trail. I hit my ribs first, then my palm, then the back of my skull. I lay there with the breath knocked clean out of me and the sky overhead too bright and too far away. To my left, Lorraine had caught the edge of a root system on her way down. She'd landed harder than me, but she'd been closer to the wall of the embankment, which slowed her. When she reached me, she was bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow, and her left ankle was already swelling inside her boot. But her eyes were clear. From above us, I heard footsteps on gravel. "Can you see them?" That was Jeff. His voice was wrong. Not panicked, flat, the way a person sounds when they're working through a problem. "I can see the ledge," Wendy said. "I can see Lyle's jacket." Movement? A pause that lasted too long. "Nothing. They're not moving." Lorraine's hand found my wrist, ice cold and steady. She put her face close to mine. "Lyle, don't move, don't make a sound." I looked at her. "Trust me," she whispered. "We need them to believe we're dead." The word landed like something physical. Dead. My brain started running in 6 directions at once, and I forced all of it down and lay still. "We should call for help," Jeff said, and the way he said it, perfunctory, rehearsed, broke something open in my chest. "No signal out here," Wendy replied. "I told you I checked before we left, and Jeff, look at that drop." A pause. "There's no way they survived that fall." I closed my eyes. They stood up there for another minute, maybe 2, speaking too quietly for me to catch everything. Then Wendy said something about getting back to the trailhead, about being prepared for questions, about the importance of their story being consistent, and then they walked away. I counted 200 seconds in my head, then I turned to my wife. "How did you know?" I said. She told me. She'd started suspecting the supplements in May. The ones Wendy had brought me in April, a glass bottle with a hand-printed label, something for joint pain and inflammation, from her own doctor, she'd said. I'd taken them every morning since without a second thought. By June I was exhausted in a way I couldn't account for, having heart flutters, seeing strange halos around lights at night. Lorraine had photographed the label and shown it to our neighbor Rita, a retired pharmacist who'd spent 30 years in clinical settings. Rita had recognized one of the listed botanicals immediately. Foxglove extract, digitalis, hidden among the legitimate ingredients in a form and dosage designed to accumulate slowly. She confronted Wendy, Lorraine said quietly, meaning herself. I confronted her privately, back in June, and it was the worst mistake I made. Wendy denied everything and told me that if I kept making accusations, she would make sure Jeff stopped bringing the grandchildren over, if we ever had grandchildren, and that she'd make me look paranoid to anyone who'd listen. Lorraine paused. I backed down, and then I hired a private investigator. His name was Skip Renfrow, a retired county sheriff out of Knoxville. In 8 weeks, Skip had built a picture of Wendy that made me feel like the ground was moving under me all over again. Her first husband had been a retired factory foreman from Southwest Virginia, 68 years old, kind man by all accounts, no history of cardiac problems. He died 3 years ago from what his doctor at the time had ruled cardiac arrhythmia secondary to an undetected underlying condition. No autopsy. 7 months before his death, he'd updated his will. Wendy had inherited 60% of his estate and relocated to Tennessee within 2 months of the funeral. Her second marriage had ended in divorce. The husband was alive, but he'd filed a restraining order 9 months in and settled quickly for cash. Skip had found him. The man had said only that he was glad he'd stopped drinking the herbal tea she made him each evening before bed. And then there was Jeff. Jeff owed $127,000 to a hard money lender in Columbus, taken out 18 months ago to cover payroll and operating costs during a slow stretch. He was past due on payments. He'd been approached at a networking event by a woman with a measuring quality in her eyes who somehow knew about his debt before he'd told her, and who had seemed, from their first conversation, to have answers for everything. Skip had followed Jeff 3 weeks before the trip. He'd watched my son spend 2 hours with an estate attorney in Nashville, a lawyer who turned out to have facilitated similar arrangements for Wendy at least twice before. They were reviewing my will. I had updated my will in May, at the recommendation of a specialist Wendy had found for me. I'd walked in thinking I was doing responsible estate planning, and walked out having signed documents that left 40% of my assets to her as my daughter-in-law. Dale's inheritance, $1.9 million that had cleared in April. and that I'd intended to divide sensibly between Lorraine and Jeff, was suddenly accessible to a woman who'd been slowly stopping my heart with foxglove extract since April. Lorraine had swapped out the supplements in August, had refilled the capsules with plain turmeric, had said nothing to me for 6 weeks while she gathered what she needed, while she recorded. She'd been recording for 4 months, a small digital recorder placed in the kitchen and the living room during Jeff and Wendy's Sunday visits. She'd given everything to Rita for safekeeping. In one recording from August, clearly audible, Wendy said into her phone in our hallway, "The timeline's slower than I expected. We may need to accelerate." We spent the first night in Rita's car in a state park campground, Lorraine wrapping my ribs with strips from a spare shirt she'd packed, both of us going through what we had and what we'd need. Skip Renfrow reached an FBI contact in Nashville the following morning. Her name was Gail Hartwell, a field agent who'd been running financial crime and elder fraud cases for 7 years, and who had Wendy's name already flagged in connection with the first husband's death. She'd never been able to build a case. When Gail heard what Lorraine had assembled, she drove out to meet us herself. The FBI held back for 4 days, letting Jeff and Wendy believe the search and recovery operation was looking for bodies. On the 5th day, Gail's team placed recording equipment in the estate attorney's Nashville office, and we watched from a parked car across the street as Wendy met with him to begin the inheritance transfer. We heard her voice, clear and businesslike, describing herself as a surviving beneficiary. We heard her on the sidewalk afterward, through a directional microphone, speaking to someone on the phone about Jeff's emotional state, that he'd been crying, that he was becoming a liability, that a grief-stricken widower has a lot of options when it comes to tragic accidents, and it's very believable. She said she'd handle it after the funds cleared. In the car beside me, Lorraine didn't speak. She just held my hand so tightly I could feel her pulse. Gail moved the next morning. They arrested Wendy at the hotel. Jeff 40 minutes later in the parking garage. The Nashville attorney, a man in Roanoke, Virginia, who had been Wendy's partner in the first husband's death and at least one other case in the Shenandoah Valley. I saw Jeff through a glass partition in the federal building. He was sitting with his attorney, staring at the floor, and when a guard brought him past the hallway and he looked up and saw me standing there, alive, upright, something in his face simply gave way. He sat down on a bench and put his face in his hands and didn't move. I didn't go to him. I wasn't there yet. His plea agreement required his full cooperation in identifying Wendy's network, her methods, the Futter family she'd targeted. He gave them everything. He confirmed he'd known the supplements were causing my illness. He said Wendy had told him it was just to slow me down, to make me confused and compliant long enough to get the estate properly arranged. He said he'd told himself that was all she meant. He said he'd known somewhere beneath that it wasn't. He received 14 years with parole eligibility at 9. The Nashville attorney was disbarred. Wendy received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole and walked out of the courtroom without once looking back. The first husband's daughter attended every day of the trial. I sat with her at lunch on the 3rd day. She told me her father had made the best sweet cornbread she'd ever tasted and had volunteered at his local VFW post for 29 years. She said she'd never stopped believing someone had hurt him. She said she'd given up hope that anyone would ever be held accountable. She thanked me. I didn't know what to say to that. I just told her I was sorry it took this long. My will was restored to its prior form. The estate attorney who'd helped Wendy revise it faced criminal charges. I paid off Jeff's predatory lending debts, not as forgiveness, not as approval, but because I didn't want dangerous people using my son as leverage while he sat in a federal prison and had no way to defend himself. I suppose that's the most honest explanation I can offer. Lorraine and I moved to a smaller house in western North Carolina, near the French Broad River. She established a foundation focused on elder financial abuse, the broader category. Not just inheritance fraud, but all the quiet ways that older people lose their assets and their dignity to people who learn to look like family first. She works with a retired probate judge and 2 forensic accountants who left private practice to do this kind of work. They helped 19 families in their first year. She's better at this than anything she's ever done, and she'd be the first to tell you she learned that from Rita. I visit Jeff twice a year. The first visit was harder than the trial, harder than the ledge, harder than anything I'd done before. We sat in a visiting room in a federal correctional facility, and he was thinner than I'd ever seen him, and he said he was sorry, and I said I heard him, and we sat and listened together for a long time. He's working toward a GED in there, taking classes 3 days a week, He calls every Sunday. He asked me once whether I'd ever be able to forgive him. I told him I thought about it every single day, which is the truth. I told him he was still my son, which is also the truth, and I can hold both things in the same hand without one canceling out the other. I'm still learning how to do that, but I'm learning. What I didn't say, and what I suspect he already knows, is that the grief isn't about what he did to me on that mountain trail. It's about the months before it. The Sunday dinners where he sat across from me and watched his wife bring me my supplements and said nothing. The phone calls where he asked how I was feeling with a particular quality of neutrality that I'd misread as distraction. The way he must have watched the circles under my eyes get deeper, and told himself the story he needed to tell himself. You can forgive a person and still grieve what they showed you about themselves. Those two things can coexist. I'm living proof. In the evenings, Lorraine and I sit on the back porch and watch the light change on the ridgeline. We've gotten good at that quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling. 38 years of marriage teaches you that the silences between two people are where you find out whether you actually know each other. I know her. I knew her all along. I just didn't know how much until she put her cold hand on my wrist on the side of a Tennessee mountain and said, "Trust me." If you're watching this and something in your gut is whispering that something isn't right, a new person in your family's life, a sudden concern about your finances, a kindness that feels calculated, I'm asking you to listen to that whisper. Don't let politeness talk you out of it. Don't let love for someone make you defend the person they chose. Get information, keep records. Find someone outside your household that you trust completely, and tell them what you know. And if someone you love in a moment of crisis tells you to stay still and trust them, listen. That instinct saved my life. It might save yours.